Israel 2 days a week, and then I do 2 days a week for an organisation called Labour First, which is one of the moderate groupings inside the Labour Party, so one of the kind of not Jeremy Corbyn wing groupings. And prior to 2015, obviously there were anti-Israel people in the Labour Party. Obviously, I've been fighting against them both on Israel and a range of other issues. Obviously, there were people pushing for BDS, but the leadership was kind of broadly sympathetic, if sometimes a little bit annoying under Ed Miliband's leadership. But I didn't feel there was any essential conflict. And then during the last 5 years, there was clearly an immense moral conflict between the two, as the Labour Party veered off sharply to the left, but particularly around the issue of what I think, first of all, just looked like anti-Semitic variants of anti-Zionism, of anti-Israel stuff. And then during the 5 years, it became apparent that the anti-Semitism actually often wasn't really connected to Israel at all. But lots of it was, but there were aspects that were to do with anti-capitalist tropes about the role of Jewish people in international finance and capitalism. So it's been a difficult 5 years, but a gradually getting better 8 or so months. I mean, in fact, the contrast between for people in the Labour Party of their political lives have started to improve at a time of national crisis over COVID, and a really miserable time for everyone in terms of everything else that's going on in the country, is rather puzzling and disturbing, or discombobulating. I'd describe it as. One thing I wanted to say: the content of what I'm going to say is very much for UK focused, because it's a talk that I've given to lots of different synagogues and stuff all over the UK. I don't pretend to be an expert on Scottish politics, but I will, if you have questions about the angles on the Scottish dynamic, the Scottish Labour Party, at the end, I know a bit about it and will be able to answer those. So I apologise for the fact that this is not a Scotland-specific talk, and I'll try and address that in the Q&A if people want to come back at me and say, well, this bit of what you said doesn't necessarily apply. And I would be the first to acknowledge, that the bit that all of us in the Labour Party are extremely conscious of is the current low relevance of the Labour Party to Scottish politics. It's like, I read the opinion polls, I'm conscious of the Trump had a polite way to describe it. I'm conscious of the level of public interest in or knowledge of Richard Leonard, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. In fact, I have to say that afterwards says something. I get that things Labour, they're of interest because you're a primarily Jewish or Israel-interested audience, but actually the Labour Party isn't particularly near to power at a Holyrood level, and could really end up very messed up after the Scottish Parliament elections next May. So what has changed since December the 12th in terms of the Labour Party's relationship with the Jewish community in Israel? Well, I think the first thing to say is that December the 12th, it wasn't a shock to people like me who kind of guessed that Jeremy Corbyn would be an electoral disaster for the Labour Party. In fact, the shock was 2017, when the exit poll came through and Labour had done rather better than expected, and that didn't fit with any of my perceptions of how politics should work. 2019 fitted with what I expected the British electorate to think about where Corbyn was coming from politically, and it was a catastrophic result for the Labour Party. 202 seats, so worse than Michael Foot, nowhere near power, going backwards, already lost all the safe seats in Scotland in 2015. now goes on to lose real kind of working class heartlands. If someone had told me in England as well, so someone told me that like all the seats in Glasgow wouldn't be Labour, and that Sedgefield and Northwest Durham and or Rother Valley, coalfield communities that were the heart of the National Union of Mine Workers in the Great Strike in the 80s. If someone told me when I was a teenager that those places would end up without Labour MPs, I would have been shocked. But then if they'd told me that Jeremy Corbyn was going to be the leader going into a general election, it probably would have made more sense as a prediction. But that massive shock has kind of reset the Labour Party. So the way I would think about the middle bit of the Labour Party, so not the ones that are absolutely obsessed with Israel or Jews or Marxism or whatever, but your average Labour Party member, is that there's a bit of a contradiction in them. They are extremely idealistic and left-wing on policy, so they probably would disagree. Yeah, they would be inherently pretty sympathetic to the Palestinians. My views on stuff like defence, they wouldn't even understand where I was coming from. They want to get to socialism, or at least a pretty radical social democracy, in a hurry. So that idealistic heart of all these people meant that they thought that Jeremy Corbyn and all his kind of counter politician and kind of not looking like a guy in a suit was extremely radical and attractive in 2015 and 2016. But at the same time, those people in the middle, whereas the Corbynite wing don't care that much about winning elections. They think that history works on kind of rules that will eventually come true and deliver socialism. So, who cares about positioning yourself for an election? The people in the middle of the party, the vast bulk of members, really would like to see a Labour government and are very distressed when they see the party crash and burn in an election. So they had a kind of wake up on the 12th of December and were like, that didn't work. We need to go for someone that looks more electable. And here's the difficult bit morally for us, that the gateway for Starmer that allowed those people, even though Starmer looks to like a mass audience, he kind of looks like he could be a sort of Tony Blair type character, nicely groomed and everything. They allowed him to be part of the range of choices they would make because he had served under Jeremy Corbyn. So this is really difficult for all of us that were very distressed and exercised about anti-Semitism, because, the debate amongst the people I'm friends with in the Labour Party was not, should we serve under Jeremy Corbyn? It was, do we actually leave the Labour Party, or do we kind of hang inside and fight and see if we can turn it round? Whereas Starmer, he did resign in 2016, but he very rapidly came back in and took office. And I would see that in sort of two regards. Well, first off, he took office to deal with the Brexit issue, to be the shadow Brexit secretary, and he had a more pro-European position than Corbyn, and he probably thought, I need to be inside to be able to influence this policy. But then there probably was a long-term calculation that he was thinking, I would like to be leader of the Labour Party, and his calculation was that he correctly, whereas I got it wrong, and I thought that the next leader the next leadership contender would come from a more overtly anti-Corbyn position. Starmer correctly was like, well, if I keep my head down and reasonably loyal, that is the key to open the door to have these middle of the party people consider that I might be acceptable. So that presents us with like a kind of immediate calls for, I guess, concern, or that's not the position that I was coming from. I voted for and campaigned for the guy in the leadership election, but as someone that had done things that were more left and more less overtly hostile to Corbyn than I personally would have been. a little bit of delving into Keir Starmer's personal background and what in it might point towards opinions that he might have on Israel and relations with the Jewish community. Well, the first thing is he is directly related to the Jewish community through marriage. So he describes his wife as from a Jewish family. And I think if you unpack that and look into background, I mean, actually it turns out that Vicky, his wife, was in Labour students at the same time as me at Cardiff University, and remembers me because I made quite a dramatic intervention in her university Labour club. I actually shut it down because it was run by the far left. So she remembers that and went on to be a sabbatical, I think, at Cardiff University Student Union. But I don't pretend that I kind of knew her, because I don't. That's something mutual friends have said, but I don't remember. But anyway, he describes her as from a Jewish family, which, when you kind of unpack it, is basically that she's not observant, but her mum and dad. Her mum passed away at the start of the year, sadly. They are observant and are people that regular attendees at the Liberal Synagogue in St John's Wood in central London. And Keir Starmer, because his wife and sort of by extension his kids are Jewish, he will turn up at synagogue as a visitor for weddings and bar mitzvahs and high holy days and stuff. So it's not like Corbyn, where he doesn't understand the Jewish community at all. He's got like some kind of personal insight, and a personal insight into the pain that Jewish people felt about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He also has some people around and supporting him who are from the community. So, for instance, the second largest funder of his campaign was Sir Trevor Chin, who's a very prominent Jewish philanthropist and big supporter of pro-Israel causes. And then the sort of team around him of like the staff that are in the leader's office and are in his campaign team are a very broad sweep of different opinions from the Labour Party. I mean, they all agreed there couldn't be more Corbynism, but they came from quite different backgrounds. So there are people who were actually part of Corbyn's team in 2015 and were then kind of driven out by Seamus Milne and Andrew Murray and the real hardliners, and had a kind of wake-up call that maybe the guy they'd backed wasn't that nice if he backed people that had driven them out of their jobs. So I'm thinking about people like Simon Fletcher and Cat Fletcher. These are not household names. Annalise Midgley, who used to be at Unite, they wouldn't be no way they would be in the same place as me on the question of Israel and the Palestinians. Though, interestingly, the first guy that I mentioned, Simon Fletcher, he was married to a Jewish lady that they're divorced, but I think it was kind of amicable. And he spent a lot of time in Israel because he had in-laws who were living near Haifa. So that even someone left-wing in the team has got a background that means they're a little bit more understanding of this than the core team around Corbyn were. Then you have a bunch of sort of technocratic people who had worked for Keir when he was the shadow Brexit secretary, who are pretty level-headed and sensible, but not hugely political in terms of partisan internal politics. They're like people that are good at doing media relations, or they're good at doing policy development. And then you have some people that are from my end of the party. So Matt Pound, who is in the political team, worked for me on the Labour side of what I do until January, has been to Israel as part of a delegation that the embassy put together of young political operators. Morgan McSweeney, who is the chief of staff, who's a very significant player, is someone who cares enough about it, not Jewish. Yeah, he's got an Irish Catholic name, he cares enough about anti-Semitism. He took his family to stand in Trafalgar Square during the Enough is Enough demo. And then the new General Secretary, David Evans, is someone who I knew had been a kind of Tony Blair supporter. The bit that I didn't realise was that even back in his student days, he had come from a kind of segment of the left that was okay on Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism, and had a reputation as a student politician in the 1980s as being someone that UJS thought had good views on this. So there's a kind of mixture in terms of the team. What is Keir's own politics in terms of the Labour Party spectrum? So people try from the hard left, they've decided to sort of push him away and push him towards people like me. Oh, he's a Blairite. Not a Blairite. Not at all. Definitely doesn't come from Blairite or even a Brownite tradition, but nor does he come from the hard left, from the people, the Tony Benn or Jeremy Corbyn position. He was very left-wing when he was a young man at university, in which I think would be the early 80s. And then when he was a lawyer, he kind of represented every single issue calls going, the miners, the Wapping print workers, the McLibel case, you name it. Pretty much the only thing that I can't find that he represented is that as a lawyer is the Palestinian calls in any way. But he's kind of, over time, kind of people mature politically, unless they're Jeremy Corbyn. And I would put him in the centre of the Labour Party, in the sort of what we sometimes describe as the soft left. So, it's not. Lots of Labour politicians don't fit neatly into, are they on the right wing of the Labour Party or the left, the Corbynite left wing. He's in that bit in the middle. But I think what I can say for certain is, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, his predecessor, if you said, like, what do you think about Israeli occupation of the West Bank or settlements or whatever, he would give left-wing answers. But he is not obsessed by Israel. It's not like the number one issue that he wakes up fixated by being angry about Israel. And he definitely isn't negatively obsessed about Jewish people or Jewish conspiracies in the way that some of the people around Corbyn and perhaps Corbyn himself were. That is not part of his political persona. Let's move on to some evidence about what he said. So there is a kind of urban myth that Keir Starmer said nothing about anti-Semitism during the years of the anti-Semitism crisis. And you can criticize him and say, he wasn't Luciana Berger or any of the other people that left the party. He wasn't even Ruth Smeeve or someone that wouldn't serve on the front bench. I've covered that there's a moral conundrum there that he did serve. But it's not true to say that he didn't say anything. He made 2 public media interventions, both of which are reasonably significant, and which are. I googled these at the start of the leadership campaign because I was thinking, well, I don't remember him saying them, but I better check what he did do. And that's quite unusual for someone that's serving in the shadow cabinet, because you're not supposed to go against the leader's position publicly. So to go on national TV in one case and radio in the other, and contradict the leader, was a reasonably significant thing to do. So in the summer of 2018, at the height when the Labour Party was tearing itself apart over the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, remember the Corbynites didn't want to adopt the whole thing. They wanted to leave out the example of anti-Semitism, which is comparing Israel's behaviour to the Nazis, which to my mind is the most anti-Semitic thing in all the IRA example, the most deliberately distressing to Jews. They thought that was an okay analogy to make. And they wanted to leave out the bit that is about the essential nature of Zionism, where the IRA definition says you can't deny Jewish self-determination by saying that the creation of the State of Israel was a racist endeavour. They want to be able to say that 1948 was racist, that Zionism is the idea of a Jewish state is inherently racist. So that's what the Corbynites want. And at a time when they were still defending that line, Starmer goes on national media and says, no, this isn't up to us. the Jewish community and a bunch of other stakeholders have agreed and asked us to sign a clear definition, and we should sign up to the whole thing, and we can't sub-edit it as the Labour Party. The political implication of that is, one of the reasons why it wasn't just ideological that Corbyn and people around him were opposing it. They were opposing it out of self-interest because they had said stuff that broke those two rules. So they didn't want to create a set of rules for the Labour Party that would involve them facing disciplinary action for anti-Semitic discourse. Summer of 2019, he makes another intervention in the anti-Semitism debate. This is Starmer, where he calls for the automatic exclusion from the Labour Party, the automatic expulsion of people where there's prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism. So he was saying, instead of the huge, convoluted, messy process that Labour has, where you get suspended and you can stay suspended for 2 years, in the case of Pete Wilsman, the guy on the NEC that talks about Trump fanatic rabbis, and nothing happens and your case just sits in a filing cabinet or takes ages for them to find a group of people to hear the case. Starmer was like, no, anti-Semitic on the face of it, expel them, and then if they want to try and take us to court to come back in or whatever, they can. And so that's a very different position, and again would have directly harmed lots of the people in factionally aligned with Corbyn. During the leadership election, remember the Board of Deputies had 10 pledges that they asked people to sign about anti-Semitism. Keir Starmer signed them. And he said, I won't be able to appoint to my front bench, if elected, any of the other deputies that don't sign these 10 pledges. And he held to that. So Dawn Butler and Richard Bergen didn't sign the pledges, despite the fact that they ran for deputy leader and got reasonably good votes. They were not put on the front bench. They weren't given any job whatsoever. Moving on then from anti-Semitism to Israel, during the leadership election, there was a Jewish labour movement hustings, and the chair asked the candidates for leader, did they consider themselves to be Zionists? And here we get a slightly more disappointing response, because Lisa Nandy, who's actually chair of the Labour Friends of Palestine, said, yeah, I believe in the self-determination of Jews and Palestinians. That makes me a Zionist. Even more surprisingly, Rebecca Long-Bailey, Corbyn's candidate, said, yeah, I believe in the right of the state of Israel to exist. Yeah, that makes me a Zionist. Keir came out with a slightly more convoluted phrasing where he said, well, I have family who, through marriage that live in Israel. I'm sympathetic to Zionism. I'm supportive of Zionism, but I wouldn't describe myself as a Zionist. I'm just putting that there as, I kind of don't, I'm disappointed by that. I would like people people just accept that anyone that believes in Jewish people's right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, it is a Zionist. It shouldn't be a dirty word that people are afraid to say. But then a few days later, he was asked by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign to sign up to 5 pledges, which included bits of targeted BDS and right of return for all the descendants of Palestinian refugees. And people asked him not to sign. There was a huge amount of pressure on him to sign, and he didn't. And he was the only one of the leadership candidates that didn't sign it. So that might indicate that he thought that PSC were a toxic organisation, or it might just be that there was stuff in there that he thought was hostages to fortune. But it's a good thing that he didn't sign. Where I would summarise my expectations of Keir's policies towards Israel. So you will get from the stuff I said earlier, I'm rather upbeat about where he might be coming from on anti-Semitism. And there's evidence subsequently to prove that I was right to feel upbeat about it. On Israel, I think he's heading to a sort of Ed Miliband type position, which at the time of Ed Miliband's leadership, those of us that were either in the Jewish world or pro-Israel world were disappointed by him. But now that we've had Jeremy Corbyn, we'd probably all give our right arms to have an Ed Miliband type position back again. So, I think there were two substantive changes made to the Labour Party policy by the party conference in the Corbyn era. One on Israel, one was settlement boycott, and the other one was arms embargo. And I'm afraid to say I don't think that Keir Starmer will try to reverse that at the Labour Party conference. I think he has other fish to fry. He's fighting the left on a lot of fronts, and this is probably, Israel stuff is probably the most difficult one. I think he knows that most of the trade unions are locked into hostile positions by their own conferences, and their votes are not available on this issue when they could be on other ones. I think a more upbeat assessment would be he wants to go back to being the sort of Labour Party leader where the last thing on earth that they think would be helpful to the Labour Party would be a huge row about Israel and the Palestinians at the party conference. All the previous Labour leaders tried to keep it off the conference agenda. And when you remember those images from the last two Labour conferences of the hundreds of Palestinian flags being flown during the Middle East debate, I don't think he wants any kinds of flags flown at Labour Party conference, unless perhaps a Union Jacks or whatever. I don't think that he is interested in the waving of Palestinian flags, or that being the kind of optics of the Labour conference. So he will avoid that fight rather than have it. It does leave open another possibility, which is not everything passed by the Labour Party conference has to go into the manifesto. There's a meeting where they decide which bits are worthy of going in the manifesto, a meeting that's more easy for the leadership to control. And it might not surprise me if the contentious bits there might get dropped and not make it into the final wording, and we'd revert back to the traditionally quite balanced wording that you have. Since he became leader, which was it the 4th of April? He immediately wrote a letter to Marie van der Zyl, the president of the Board of Deputies. It was the first letter that he sent. And it was a very good letter, very nicely worded letter, and received a very warm, nicely worded reply from the BOD as well. He's gone on to have, I mean, they're not physical meetings because of COVID, but he's had meetings with the JLC, the board, and CST. He's had meetings with the chief rabbi and with the Jewish labour movement. So all of the channels of communication with the Jewish world and of listening and of speaking to each other that had disappeared during the Corbyn era have reopened. The people around Corbyn, so the thing was that Starmer ran talking about party unity. And the people around Corbyn responded by being very unified with him for 6 days. And on the 12th, I think it was, of April, there was the leaked document about which was a response to, purported to be a response to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission investigation into Labour anti-Semitism that had not been sent because Labour's lawyers said you can't send this because it might be defamatory to a whole bunch of people and it might breach GDPR for a whole bunch of people. GDPR is the rules about data protection on personal data. It's 850 pages of, hung around bits of factual stuff like people's WhatsApp messages and emails and stuff. But the actual narrative that it presents is the biggest loads of codswallop that I've ever had the misfortune to read 850 pages. The good bit is, at the start of this leaked document, it accepts that Labour had been institutionally anti-Semitic. So they've gone, this is written by Corbynites, they've gone from saying there's no anti-Semitism at all in the Labour Party. The only people that are anti-Semitic are skinheads. 2, there's a few cranks. 2, there's quite a bit of this on the left, but it's 0.04% of the membership and we're dealing with it. 2, sorry, Gov, we were institutionally anti-Semitic, but pivoted and bizarrely created this narrative where they say that anti-Semitism was the fault of the evil Blairites because they were so hostile to Jeremy Corbyn that it kind of meant that it was difficult for him to do anything and difficult for him to deal with anti-Semitism, and it was all caused by bad people that were basically Blairites that worked at Labour Party HQ, and it is an attempt to smear the staff who went and were whistleblowers on the Panorama programme, and to present the people that blew the whistle on anti-Semitism as somehow culpable for it. It's a very, very unpleasant document and is the subject of multiple legal cases. We then also had provocations on the issue of anti-Semitism, starting with attempts to go up to the line of where the Labour Party rulebook was, lean across it into territory that the Board of Deputies would like action taken on but isn't yet against the Labour Party rules, in order to make Starmer look weak, that he couldn't take action. So you had Diane Abbott and Belle Ribeiro Aderi, who's an who's an MP that's close to Diane, doing a Jewish Voice for Labour. That's the tiny fringe group that are anti-Israel and say that there's no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, doing a Zoom call for them, where people like Jackie Walker and Tony Greenstein, who have been expelled from the Labour Party for really pretty vile anti-Semitism, were on the call with them, and they were sharing a platform with them, which the Board of Deputies wants, and I agree with them, wants banned as something that Labour members shouldn't do. The kind of crunch where you get to see both the good side of Starmer on the anti-Semitism and the lots better than Corbyn, but not what we would want side on the Israel stuff, comes about a month or two ago. Oh, Stanley, you're accidentally sharing your screen. Shall I just keep talking? Yeah. The umbrellas were great as a screensaver. Can everyone still hear me? Yep. So don't worry, I'm near the end. If you were losing the will to live at so there's this crunch week where Rebecca Long Bailey, the previous leadership candidate and shadow cabinet member, tweets a link to a Guardian story, a Guardian interview with Maxine Peake, I think her name is, the actress, who repeats the anti-Semitic trope that the policeman who killed George Floyd in Minneapolis had been trained by the Israeli secret services or some nonsense like that. And she is asked by Starmer's incandescent, instructs her to take it down and to apologise properly. She keeps saying no. So after 4 hours of her not taking it down and not apologising properly, he sacks her from the front bench. That is an incredibly big deal. They did not believe he was strong enough to do that. They thought that he is weak and spineless and wouldn't possibly do anything as politically ballsy as sack Corbyn's successor who had run against him and to pick a fight with them. And he did it, and it's solidified his leadership and is a real blow to the hard left, because it shows them that they have no traction now. That if he can sack her, that anyone that steps out of line on anti-Semitism is not safe. But then on the Israel side of stuff, the same week, reaction to the proposals around extension of sovereignty, or some people would describe it as annexation of bits of the West Bank. Lisa Nandy, as Shadow Foreign Secretary, says that she's in favour of sanctions. as a response to that. And then when you probe, you discover that sanctions actually means boycott of settlement goods, but the language is not good. We don't want, none of us, I would hope on this call, want sanctions against Israel, even if we totally disagree with what was proposed, and which, now that the deal with the UAE has happened, it looks like nothing will happen anyway. But even if we totally disagree with Netanyahu and what he proposed, I hope people on the call don't believe in responding to that with sanctions, or any kind of thing that could be interpreted as a version of BDS. They claim, so it's like, I know these guys. Like, if I send them an email, they know me well enough that I get a personal reply from them. I could ring them up and chat to them about it. They don't think it's BDS. They are absolutely convinced that they don't support BDS. This is Lisa and Wayne David, the Shadow Middle East Minister, and that boycott of settlement goods isn't part of BDS. I obviously totally disagree, which is why I've been running a petition against their proposal for the last couple of months. But I think that those things happening in the same week illustrate that Starmer is actually being quite assertive on the anti-Semitism issue. But if you were going to be really cynical, you could just say ideologically these guys are to the left of people like me, so they're going to have a worse position on Israel. Or you could say that they felt they had to somehow sort of compensate, that because they're scared of the stuff where people shout at them, oh, you're trying to shut down debate about Israel, and they're like saying, well, no, look, we're really tough on anti-Semitism, but we're also tough on Netanyahu. But anyway, it's not pleasing to us as pro-Israel campaigners. What's the current state of play? Well, Starmer has solidified his position in the Labour Party far faster than anyone expected. There are three bits of power, points of power in the Labour Party. There is the leader's office and the leader. There's the general secretary and the people running the party headquarters. And there's the National Executive Committee. And if you hold all three, you can pretty much get the Labour Party to do whatever you want it to. So he obviously won the leadership. What was unexpected was there was another campaign going on. I'm just pausing because it says my internet connection is on. So there's another campaign at the same time with a more restricted electorate that I was in the background running the campaign for with my Labour hat on, which is the National Executive Committee, and the two moderates won that election. So it changed the control of the National Executive. So it's very finely balanced, but Starmer can normally win. And then he used the fact that he could win on the National Executive to get this guy that I've told you is good on anti-Semitism and is basically from a sort of Tony Blair background, David Evans, in as the General Secretary, and get out Jenny Formby, who's a kind of arch Corbynite and close personal friend of actually, she's not the one that's a close personal friend. She's the mother of Len McCluskey's children. I get confused about different prominent figures in the Labour Party hierarchy, previous Labour Party hierarchy, and the nature of their personal relationships with Len McCluskey from Unite. So he's got the kind of three nodal points. There is now a new National Executive Committee election for more seats on the NEC, which I declare an interest. I'm personally a candidate for it. I'm one of the people running on the moderate team for those seats. We'll get the result in November. If I can get elected and I'm, work for We Believe in Israel, that might send quite a signal about the Labour Party changing. The bit that we don't know is we know that there has been a vast change in the membership of the Labour Party. So lots and lots of people joined. Over 100,000 people joined to vote to change the party, basically. No one joined at the end of 2019 to keep Corbyn. They were already in. This is new people that joined or rejoined because they wanted Labour to change direction. And lots of the most extreme Corbynites have walked because their own rhetoric has made them walk. Like the rhetoric from their side about, still all a stitch up and Starmer's a Blairite has made lots of those people walk out. And it'll be interesting to see, not just interesting, hugely important to see in the NEC election, whether that has further shifted the political dynamic in the party more towards the moderate and by extension okay on anti-Semitism wing. And then we have a series of, two key reports coming. So at the start of September, we should have the Equalities and Human Rights Commission report. And then at the turn of the year, we should have the Ford Inquiry report, which is a report into that 850-page leak that I was telling you about. So I think we need to be a little bit cautious about our expectations around the EHRC report. It might be that it's the blockbuster of all reports and kind of really throws the book at Corbyn and people around him for their failure to deal with this. But I'm a little bit sceptical that it will give those of us that campaigned against Labour anti-Semitism everything that we wanted to, because the EHRC is a quango. So the people that wrote it are kind of civil servants. The language that they use is going to be restrained and cautious. I think it is probably less likely to talk about the culpability of individuals and more about processes and systems and the new processes the party needs to put in place. And I certainly doubt that it will tackle the politics behind this, the linkage between extreme left politics on Israel and on anti-capitalism and the and anti-Semitism, and how that kind of all came out of Soviet-era propaganda, etc. I don't think that it's a political enough organisation to really explain that. It's going to just kind of look at it, oh, here was a series of problems, here was how the Labour Party dealt with it, and yeah, they didn't deal with it correctly, and this is the procedures they need to put in place. So I would be restrained about it, and I think it more important than the report is the Labour Party's response to it. So we know that the Labour Party is going to accept all the recommendations. They've already said that they will. It's pretty sensible to accept the recommendations from a statutory body that's instructing you to do things with all the force of the law behind it. But it's the tone of, does Starmer really use this as a turning point in the party's history? Is this his moment of comparison to when Kinnock took on Militant at the Brighton conference in '85? Different set of issues, but will this be a big kind of break point? Because if he tackles it hard enough and takes action against enough of the people that were behind the anti-Semitism, lots of the others will leave of their own accord anyway, and that will further drive the party into a virtuous circle of improvement. And then I actually think that the Ford inquiry, which is an internal Labour Party inquiry into the leak, may well fire some of the bullets that the EHRC doesn't, because it's an inherently more political report. So we're entering into a critical period. The Labour Party gets its response wrong to this. It has not. For the Jewish community, I mean, I don't even expect the Jewish community to suddenly start going, oh, I might vote Labour again. It is understandable after the last 5 years that most people in the Jewish community are going to take many, many more years of change, or perhaps never. The relationship is very, very burnt. But there's a whole set of other people who, they don't have a personal stake in this, but it's a indicative issue of the malaise that Labour got into, and the extent to which Starmer aggressively tackles it will be an important signal for them about whether Labour has really changed or not. So my expectation, based on what I know about people around and what I've seen of the behaviour so far and what I believe his motives to be, is that I think he will act firmly and boldly on anti-Semitism. Some of it has already happened. A lot of people have quietly been suspended or expelled. But I sadly do not expect that, as someone that campaigns for Israel, that I am going to be able to influence him to shift to where I would like him to be on Israel. But even the positions that he will take are immeasurably better and more rational and less likely to fuel anti-Semitism than the very extreme and obsessive positions on Israel that Jeremy Corbyn took. I hope that all made sense, and I'm very happy to field any questions you've got, including whether there's anything on the Scottish specifics that I obviously didn't cover there. Sammy, do you want to referee who comes in and asks questions? You're on mute.
I was waiting for Jim to unmute me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the format's going to be, I'll ask the first question, and then if people put up their hands, we'll try and get through as many questions as possible. What I'd like to ask you, before the last election in Scotland, there was a lot of discussion about whether the SNP would be prepared to sign up with Corbyn and to form a government against the Tories. I was wondering if you know how optimistic were the Labour Party with regards to their chances of possibly forming a government with or without the SNP, and how surprised were they at the very disappointing results that they got?
So they clearly believe their own hype, because you can tell that from their narrative around targeting of marginal seats, that they think that it was a terrible crime that in 2017 the Labour Party headquarters, at that stage run by moderates, fought a defensive battle, and that the correct thing to do was to chase after non-Labour held seats because there were going to be gains. So, and the Momentum people in my patch in Oxford, they didn't hang around in Oxford helping the now Shadow Chancellor. They all got in minibuses and drove off to North Swindon, which Labour went on to lose by 11,000 votes. So someone in party headquarters or in Momentum headquarters believed their own hype that those places were winnable. And they kind of, because they'd had this situation once where they went into an election on just over 20% and then ended on 40%, they sort of believed that that would happen in every general election, that if only that Jeremy Corbyn was uniquely charismatic and really good at campaigning, and if you put him in the middle of a field all over the country, or at rock festivals or whatever, people would only have to see him and they would start to believe in Jeremy. And they also had a belief that media bias is less during the election campaign, that because the broadcast media have to show the same amount of each programme. Like, these guys are really paranoid about how right-wing they think that the BBC is. It's quite amusing to, as an anecdote to a pro-Israel audience that probably thinks that the BBC is biased in a left-wing direction. But these guys think the BBC is incredibly biased, and the only time that it ever gives left-wingers a fair go is during the month of the election campaign. So they kind of thought that they would get an extra 20, they would go up in the polls just like they did before. And they would have sold Scottish, they would have sold United Kingdom unionism down the river, both because they're not particularly ideologically committed to it, whereas the mainstream of the Labour Party does believe in the union, and because they actually, it's almost like they kind of they're kind of envious of the SNP for, on some things like Trident, saying the things that the Labour left would like to be Labour policy as well. So if Sturgeon had turned up and said, well, we'll put you into number 10, Jeremy, but the condition is we have another referendum on independence. Oh, and you've got to, you can't renew Trident, he would have bitten her arm off. Does that make sense? You're muted again.
I know, I don't do the muting and unmuting, so.
Right, okay.
So the next question, while people are thinking, is from Saul Judah, who wonders if there's any chance that Tom Watson might come back into the Labour Party or even the front bench.
Okay, so he's in the Labour Party.
Yes,
never
sorry,
left
the
Labour.
front bench.
Yeah.
Front bench.
So there is this speculation that he got rejected for a peerage in the round that Corbyn put in, and then his name seems to have been put back in by Starmer. So if you come back into the House of Lords as a working peer, like, you pretty much have to do something, because there aren't that many peers that are young enough and sort of doing it full time to cover all the briefs. So it's likely that he would probably accept, if he gets put in the House of Lords, he might accept being some kind of front bencher, but that wouldn't be in the shadow cabinet. I don't think. I think that he's had his moment. I mean, Tom is someone that I'm a friend of. We shared a house. It's amazing that we're still friends after sharing a house with him back in the mid-90s. So I kind of feel like I know where he's at a reasonable amount. And he basically quit because he just couldn't bear being in the same room. You know, done 5 years with people that were acting kind of like political gangsters, and it was just horrible. He's kind of having a bit of a midlife rejig or whatever, where the guy is physically a different man, he's lost loads of weight, is a lot fitter, he's dealt with all his health problems. He has got quite a pleasant new job with the music industry as chairman of like the main music industry trade body. So I could see him doing a bit, junior spokesperson for something in the House of Lords, but I unless I've totally misunderstood the situation, I don't see him coming back into the real sort of political front rank.
Thank you. The next question is from Mickey Green, who actually spends half his time in Scotland and half his time in Israel. And he's actually in Scotland at the moment. And he's asking a question: do you think that the normalization agreement, which is about to be signed, I assume, with the UAE, and maybe the first of a number of these agreements, might soften the Labour Party's and Starmer's position towards Israel?
Well, it just takes away the because they were saying this stuff around you call it sanctions, you call it settlement boycott or whatever, targeted boycott, was being floated as a response to any extension of sovereignty into any of the settlements or the Jordan Valley. The quid pro quo of the I think Netanyahu was probably going to drop the whole annexation stuff anyway. I don't think he was going to pursue it. I think it was probably a bit of an electoral ploy, and Netanyahu's actually a huge pragmatist when it comes to security and relations with the Palestinians. But in any case, this has killed it completely, as far as I can see. The quid pro quo for a very nice deal with the UAE, a historic deal that gives Netanyahu a political legacy, seems to be to drop any extension of sovereignty stuff. So the reason that the Labour Party had for pursuing this bad policy disappears and goes on the back burner. And I know that Labour Friends of Israel will be going to see Lisa Nandy and saying, look, can you make it explicit that you're not interested in this anymore because the circumstances it was trying to deter no longer exist. And I think there will be some optics that will be, I would have thought post-COVID, I would have thought Israel will be very near the top of the list of countries that Keir Starmer will go and visit. I think the kind of stuff that you would expect a Labour Party leader that wanted to look serious about relationships with Israel and about the Middle East, like talking to all the political parties there, mean, talking to the Palestinians as well. If you go to Jerusalem, you also go into Ramallah, but doing some stuff that will be very reassuring for the community, like laying a wreath at Yad Vashem and stuff that indicates a kind of understanding of Jewish history and Jewish suffering and of what anti-Semitism leads to. I would expect him to do that as soon as kind of normal travel arrangements permit. But Mickey's question is kind of correct in that basically Labour's position remains two states, and they want a peace process. So stuff that looks like it's advancing peace, they're going to say good things about and react in a good way to.
I'm looking for hands to go up if anybody wants to ask a question. Neil, Jean, could you unmute Neil Lau, please? Okay, Neil.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank Glasgow Friends for Israel for inviting me, and thanks for Luke for coming and giving us insights of how all the politics work. Luke, you can appreciate that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party still. It's not going to go away, and there is a lot of anti-Indian, Hindu, same as anti-Semitism in the party. Now, it's not going to go away over 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years. It's embedded in the kind of Labour Party for some time now. Now, in Scotland, you can appreciate, obviously, where I come from. It's healthy to have the Labour Party fighting, and having a foothold in Holyrood. But unfortunately, they've suffered, as in everywhere. How do you bring that back? Because obviously, in my opinion, the leader that they have in the Labour Party, who's a Scottish leader, is not a helpful person. I don't see him as a viable option for the electorate to vote for. So what is Keir Starmer, in your view, policy regarding this? Because the SNP, in my view, this is not in everyone's view, but in my view, I think they're very anti-Semitic and anti-Indian. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. So first off, on your broader point about it's not going to go, you're right. So the tide is going back out, but it leaves some pebbles or whatever behind it, and it is going to be a very long process involving an awful lot of Labour Party staff time, etc., to dig out people with blatantly anti-Semitic views from local constituency Labour parties and to make those better places. I mean, I had a horrific evening on Friday when I tried to get a nomination from the NEC from my own constituency in Oxford. Very personalised attacks that were all about foreign policy, but the people behind them are people who I know have on the record as having an ambivalent position on things like the IRA definition. I think the Israel bit was unspoken. They're being more careful. So they go on about his views on the Middle East, and try to make out that what they're really worried about is whether I think that what I think about Saudi Arabia in Yemen or whatever. But really the unspoken subtext is about what my job is and my position on Israel. And and then there is, you're right, an increasing alienation of both the Hindu and the Sikh communities going on, which is electoral madness, because driving communities that the Tories are making big overtures to into the arms of the Conservative Party in England. Don't know whether it's into the arms of the SNP in Scotland, but a lot of it is coming from the same political direction of kind of moving from what Labour used to have, like a balanced position on Kashmir that did talk about human rights and self-determination and stuff, but was balanced about the India and Pakistan's positions, and there's a kind of drive to make it like a more overtly hostile to India position that is obviously completely alienating to people from the Hindu and Sikh communities. Going on to the specifics about Scotland. So, I mean, the basic problem is that, okay, so I'm going to wheel back a bit because I just want to provide some context for people that don't follow the Scottish Labour Party. There's this odd situation where it now has a leader who is to the left of the UK leader, was elected on a kind of Corbynite ticket, though he's actually not quite that bad. He's more sort of a trade union-y GMB guy. I mean, he's a little bit too pedestrian to be an out-and-out Corbynite. He's not someone that's burning any barns down. But the membership of the Scottish Labour Party and the constituency parties were, on the whole, to the right of the English ones during the Corbyn era. So I would usually do better in nominations from Scotland than I did from English CLPs, and it was certainly the case in the 2016 Labour leadership election. Scotland was the only bit of the UK that voted for Owen Smith rather than Jeremy Corbyn. So, and the reason behind that feeds into what the question you're asking about the SNP. So the set of people who are very radical on Palestine, etc., kind of the kind of ultra left people that joined the Labour Party in 2015 to vote for Corbyn were not available in Scotland, because in 2014, during the independence referendum, they'd already got themselves involved in the SNP calls. So that they'd already gone into another party. I don't think that means that the SNP is like a hard left party. It isn't. The SNP is a very broad catch-all party that includes some quite moderate centrist social democratic people, includes very left people, and it includes some people that are on the right of the political spectrum. But there's definitely a set of people that are very exercised about Israel and see parallels between they think Israel's an imperialist power oppressing the Palestinians, and England is an imperialist power oppressing the Scots, and it's like a kind of quieter version of the sort of politics around Israel that you see in the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland. With the best will in the world, I don't see Richard Leonard getting cut through. It's too near to. We're not that far from the election. He's been in the job quite a while. It just doesn't have traction with the electorate or a distinctive offer, and that is beginning to damage Keir Starmer as well. People are like, well, how come you're not doing better in the polls? When really it's because the Scottish Labour Party isn't delivering. The problem is who would stand. So the two obvious people that would be broadly moderate, Anna Sawar was badly burnt by the nastiness of the league, and Jackie Bailey, who I really think is brilliant. I mean, she's a wonderful person. She doesn't want to stand anyway. I think one of the sad things is the generation of Scottish Labour politicians who lost their seats in 2015, who were in some cases very high level in UK politics as well. So Jim Murphy and Douglas Alexander and people like that have sort of completely gone, and like none of them have decided to hang around and try to get back into Scottish politics. So it temporarily leaves a bit of a vacuum of leadership in the Scottish Party. It's whether the Labour Party can identify a new generation of people and bring them through in the selections for Holyrood candidates. It really, really, really needs to strengthen the team that it's got in Holyrood. Would be the first move to any kind of rebirth of Labour in Scotland.
Thank you. Next question from anybody? Hand up, anyone? I'm looking for hands going up.
There's John Copeland.
John, have you got a question? Could we unmute John?
Okay. Hello there.
Aye.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk, and it gave a kind of a lifted the lid on the frenetic world of Labour in particularly London, you know. But when it comes to Scotland, I think I noticed that the Labour Party were a bit wobbly on the union in this respect. They saw federalism as blue water thinking that separated them from the Conservatives and made them possibly appeal to some of the SNP. So I would appeal to the Labour Party, please do not consider federalism, because the SNP's, what their ploy is to get as much power, and it's like stepping stones to ultimate separation. Yep. And that's what I see federalism as, a real danger. Now, what do you know, or what is the Labour Party's view on federalism, please? Thank you.
Well, so my understanding is that was kind of cooked up by Richard Leonard as his distinctive position, and actually really angered a lot of the Labour grassroots in Scotland. So I would think if there is a change of Scottish leader of the party, that policy may get binned in favour of return to a more overt support for the union. And it's in a way, I think there's a connectivity between the Westminster politics and the Holyrood politics, which is that if Labour gets its act together in England and looks like it is a potential, or in a UK level, looks like it's a potential alternative government to the Tories, that reduces the appeal for people on the left in Scotland to go for nationalism, because part of what is driving it is looking at, well, Labour's incapable of winning, so we're stuck with Boris Johnson, who we don't want, and a government that doesn't share most Scottish people's values. Will look at independence as a way of escaping from always having this Tory government. Whereas if the political situation was more competitive at a Westminster level, and there was some chance of a Labour government, you were a Scottish person that was basically on the centre-left, you would start thinking, well, yeah, I could start voting Labour, and that might contribute to Labour getting a majority and getting rid of this Tory government that I don't like. That's where I see the connectivity. This is getting obviously on this stuff. Anything that I say about these aspects of politics, I'm talking with my personal Labour Party hat on, not as a. We Believe in Israel definitely doesn't have positions on anything to do with domestic UK politics, and we're a broad coalition that we welcome people that have totally different perspectives on whichever political party you support in East Renfrewshire or whichever other bits of Scotland that you live in. You're very welcome in our pro-Israel coalition. I just thought I'd better stress that as I drifted into territory that was a little bit off topic.
Thank you, Hugh. Another question from Catriona, which is one that I was also going to ask. With the general election in the UK still over 4 years away, and plenty of time for Boris to foul up and make more of a mess than he's done so far, do you think there's any chance that Starmer might be able to stand up as a credible opponent and substitute, could be Prime Minister in 4 years' time?
Okay, so I think he's already individually credible. Like, the public look at him and go, I could imagine that guy being Prime Minister. Look at how he handles himself in question time. Look at how he does press conferences or whatever. He's clearly a man of a great deal of competence and appears to come across as very kind of common sense. So I think the public he's past the kind of, could I see this guy having been the most powerful politician in the country? And we're in a weird situation where in 2017 and 2019, the Labour Party was more popular than its leader, and some people continued to vote Labour despite the fact that they hated Corbyn's guts or were terrified by him, but they just about clung on to Labour because they liked their local MP, or they residually liked what the party had done in government, or the broad sweep of what it stood for. We're now in a situation where Starmer's personal ratings are really quite good, and the Labour Party is like an anchor on him. So when we go and knock doors in the future, I'm expecting people to say, "Oh well, I like your leader. I wish he could be Prime Minister, but I'm not keen. Yeah, he hasn't quite got rid of all the Corbyn era people." I'm a bit of a kind of student of electoral history and patterns in elections. Jumping from 202 seats to 326 has never happened. Not other than in the really bizarre circumstances of 1945, where there hadn't been a general election for 10 years and there'd been a world war in between. It's like even the biggest swings since then wouldn't deliver that bigger change of seats, and seats that were historic marginals. I grew up in Kent, all of those kind of seats along the Thames side that go Labour when there's a Labour government, and nowhere near. That's before you even get into the two big pillars that have gone: the pillar of Scotland and the pillar of the mining seats, and coming up with a political formula that can simultaneously appeal to winning back Scotland, which is anti-Brexit, to winning back English mining seats that are pro-Brexit, and to winning back traditional swing marginals where there's lots of people, read the Daily Mail or whatever. It's going to take an act of political genius to come up with that formula. So it's not. I've never say never. It's not totally beyond the realms of possibility that you could get a hung parliament and somehow see Starmer come in as Prime Minister. But I actually think there'll be quite a nasty expectations game played by the Corbynites, where they will say, well, of course he should gain 123 seats or whatever, knowing that that's almost electorally impossible. And actually, say he gained 50, that's huge. That's a huge recovery for Labour, but the Corbynites will be trying to set that up as he has to resign because he only gained 50 seats.
Yeah, but I suppose if the SNP was still around, you might be able to do a deal with them, but by then it might be that we've voted for independence and the SNP don't have any seats in Westminster. So that makes it more difficult. Yeah. There's a question from Saul about George Galloway. There's been some reports that Galloway might be trying to work his way back into the Labour Party to get some more popularity. Have you heard anything about that?
I think you misunderstood the question. So there's definitely no question of him getting anywhere near the Labour Party. Even Corbyn wasn't going to let him back in the Labour Party. I mean, this is like the original reasons for the expulsion and his subsequent behaviour and constantly running very vicious campaigns against Labour and against ethnic minority women MPs in Bradford and in Tower Hamlets mean that he's never going to be allowed anywhere near the Labour Party. I think the question was more about that he might be planning to come back to Scotland and to Scottish politics, where my understanding of Galloway, the unusual mixture of politics that Galloway represents is that he is a unionist. So he'd be running as some kind of to the left of Labour. Is obviously all the pretty vile, extremely vile positioning that he has on issues that we would care about to do with Israel and the Middle East. But into that mix is that he would be quite a powerful voice in the debate about Scotland's future. I would never underestimate the guy. I mean, he is awful. I'm going to be careful what I say because he's also very litigious, so I don't want to be sued for saying anything particularly bad about him. But he is an incredibly effective campaigner. I did the Labour Party's inquiry into, when I was on the NEC before, I did the Labour Party inquiry into how he won in Bradford. The guy was using social media in a really innovative way to get the Muslim community to kind of get the word out and go out and vote for him. Incredibly impressive campaigner, the way that he won that by-election. And he's probably the best orator of his generation. He's an absolutely stunning public speaker. So in the same way that the Jewish community, it's like oratory is valued because, you know, if you've got to sit there on a Saturday morning, you kind of learn to value someone coming in and doing a really good talk. The Muslim community is like it's the same in mosques. The power of rhetoric and oratory can cut through. It's a community where large numbers of people will gather in one place and listen to someone speak, and he is really, really dangerously good at it, particularly with audiences that are interested in politics but not that politically sophisticated, and who he can kind of be populist and whip them up. So I would be extremely alarmed by the latest stage in his carpet bagging round different United Kingdom political constituencies. If he reappeared anywhere in Scotland, that is not a good thing.
Can you say something about the momentum and what hold momentum still have within the Labour Party, and maybe on Keir Starmer, and also John Lansman? What's his position there? Okay,
so momentum, as people know, was the organisation set up using the data from Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaigns to kind of create a mass faction in the Labour Party. It is still quite strong in quite a lot of constituency parties, but mainly in the ones that have there's a sort of lagging indicator in the Labour Party. Some local Labour parties have meetings that we call all-member meetings, where everyone can turn up. Particularly, that's probably the case in most of Scotland because the local parties would be a bit smaller. In the ones with all-member meetings, momentum is at risk of getting swept away by the new people that have joined. Where there's a different system, which is where you elect delegates from branches or trade unions, momentum will hang on a bit longer, because that you have to wait for the next AGM of the local party before the delegations change. And like for new members, like it's all a bit effortful to become a delegate to a committee and stuff. So they will be a bit stronger in places like that and will fight a rearguard action. They're extremely internally divided. They had an internal ballot to elect a new national committee where the people close to John Lansman, the founder, and the kind of establishment of the left, like all the famous names from around Corbyn, were beaten by a load of insurgents who are so distant from the heart of power that the new national co-chair actually lives in New York and is a member of the international wing of the international branch of the Labour Party. And that grouping seems to be closer to John McDonnell. It seems like I would describe the coalition that was on Lansman's side as a weird coalition of Lansman was trying to promote a lot of young people that were kind of hipster generation of like kind of people that were new to politics and very idealistic, but he was working with a load of cynical old Stalinists who were just suckers for power in the trade union movement and the Labour Party. And then the McDonnell-like people who have taken control of momentum are more Trotskyist, I think. But they've now grabbed the organisation, they've grabbed the data. John Lansman is no longer in charge of it. He's not even standing for the NEC. I mean, I actually get on quite well with the guy, despite the fact we dislike each other's politics. And so I feel a bit sorry for him. It's like he's been rejected by the organisation that he built up. And this is really bad news on the anti-Semitism stuff, because although John is way to the left of any of us on Israel, the fact that he is Jewish and has spent some time there, at least he can see real hardcore anti-Semitism, and he was experiencing anti-Semitism, people kind of presenting him as the manipulative kind of guy in the shadows or whatever. So whilst he was he wasn't in the position we would want him to be in on anti-Semitism, he wasn't in a totally awful one as well. and you can see from the discourse that Momentum are putting out that any restraining effort that John Landsman had on them has disappeared with him, and that they are overtly just pushing the line that I said was in this leaked report about it was all the fault of the anti-Semitism, all the fault of the Blairites type stuff. They've really lost the plot. I mean, have a look at their email threads and stuff, and it's like they were pretty bad to start with, and they're even worse now.
Thank you. I'm looking for any hands. Has anybody got any other questions? If not, Jean, could you maybe unmute everybody? I'm just still looking quickly to see if anyone's got a question, but I can't see one. So in that case, I'd very much like to thank you, Luke, for spending the evening with us and giving us a wonderful insight into what's happening in the Labour Party and what the changes are and what there have been in this dramatic change from Corbyn to Starmer. And I still think that in 4 years' time, he could be challenging, Labour could be challenging the Tories, because I don't think the Tories are doing a great job at the moment. And who knows what's going to be happening over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask everybody to show our appreciation to Luke. It's just a quick clap. And
well done, well done.
Thank you. And we will try and organize another session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. We'll try and organize another session in 6 weeks' time or 8 weeks' time. So thank you very much indeed, Luke, and I'm sure we'll be in touch with you soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Everyone, see you soon. Hope to see you in the flesh soon.
Yes,
when COVID
That'd be
goes.
nice, won't it? That would be really nice.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Jean.
Bye, bye everyone.
Good night. Bye, Eileen.
Bye. Bye.